Throughout the vastness of the galaxy, there is no force that is as expansive, as well-equipped, or as awe-inspiring as the Imperial Navy, the most impressive armada the galaxy has ever seen assembled under one banner. Let's talk about it. Sukui Gar Nervad. I am Tad Larkin, the lore master of Manda-LORE, and today I'll be digging through the archives to bring you organizational data and the history of the Imperial Navy. The massive warships of the Imperial Navy patrolling the space lanes were a common sight among those living within the borders of the Galactic Empire, bringing feelings of security to its loyal citizens while being wielded as a hammer to crush those who opposed it. But just how big was the Imperial Navy? Where did it come from? And how was it organized? Like most of the institutions within Palpatine's Galactic Empire, be them civil or military, the Imperial Navy has its origins stem from the Galactic Republic that the Empire replaced. 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, a fledgling republic won its final battle in a millennia-long war against the Sith, but was so fractured by this conflict that it had to be reorganized, culminating in the Ruusan Reformations, which dissolved the Republic's standing army and navy in favor of the Jedi Order as its primary peacekeepers. But the Jedi weren't alone in this task. The Judicial Department raised their own land and space forces to assist the Jedi. However, these new judicial forces were too few in number, and their fleets consisted of ships no larger than a corvette class with the firepower not exceeding as such to amount to a proper navy. The Ruusan Reformations did allow for member systems within the Republic to raise their own small planetary security fleets, but these fleets had stringent limitations on how many ships and which ship classifications could compose them. This ensured that they were used strictly for defense, and could not be wielded to great effect against neighboring star systems or the government itself for expansionary purposes. For example, under the Ruusan Reformations, ships over 600 meters in length, which we now call cruisers under the Anaxis War College ship classifications established during the Clone Wars, were limited to slower hyperdrives and increasingly less powerful armament as you went up in size, which led ship manufacturers, such as Rendili Star Drive most famously, to develop heavily armed and armored cruisers just at or under that 600-meter mark. Of course, loopholes were found and special exemptions were made for select wealthy core planets and organizations to build battle cruisers and battleships, but this wasn't too common. Still, officers and crews needed to be trained for these planetary security fleets as well as the Republic judicial forces, so wealthy and noble families from all across the galaxy sent their young males and females to train at sanctioned military academies, the most famous and prestigious of which resided on Anaxis, Carida, Korlag, Ryathal, and Prefspelt 4. These military academies would continue operation well within the Empire's regime, producing some of the most capable officers in the Imperial Navy. It wasn't until the final decades of the Republic that calls for rearmament were being made in the Galactic Senate, in the wake of pirate attacks by the Nebula Front and the so-called Stark Commercial Combine, and while the Supreme Chancellor and the judicial forces were hesitant to act, others took matters into their own hands. At the forefront of these militarists vying for the re-establishment of the Republic Navy was Eriadu Senator Ranulph Tarkin, elder cousin of the infamous Grand Moff Williff Tarkin, and it's him who we can attribute to being the spiritual father of the latter Republic and thus Imperial Navy, after he raised his own fleet from his home sector to combat the Stark Commercial Combine's raids in 44 BBY. Tarkin's short-lived Republic Navy, as his proponents called it, met its end at the first and only battle of the Stark hyperspace conflict, on Troikan, where a majority of his forces, made up of mostly consular corvettes and light cruisers, were obliterated by Iako Stark's forces, and were only saved from complete destruction by the Jedi and the Trade Federation. While the Stark hyperspace conflict utterly failed to remilitarize the Republic, the subsequent Yinchori uprising and Naboo blockade crisis of 33 and 32 BBY only strengthened the position of the militarists that a standing army and navy needed to be re-established. But they wouldn't get their wish until the Separatist crisis 10 standard years later ushered in the passing of the Military Creation Act. Following the outbreak of the Clone Wars and the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY, the newly re-established Republic Navy was stitched together from the judicial forces and elements of certain planetary security forces to shore up the force of Acclamator-class assault ships produced by Rothana Heavy Engineering to accompany the newly uncovered Grand Army of the Republic created by the Kaminoan cloners. Renowned admirals, captains, and their crews from all over the Republic's member systems' PSF fleets answered the call to man these new fleets, alongside clone personnel against the Confederacy of Independent Systems Navy. Meanwhile, the shipbuilders of Kuat and Drandili were commissioned to design larger, more heavily armed ships to form a stronger backbone for the nascent Republic Navy, culminating in the iconic Venator-class and Victory-class Star Destroyers, which would eventually deploy at the height of the war's second standard year. The Victory class was the first of these new Star Destroyers, which would become a ship classification of their own, to resemble the latter Imperial design that we're familiar with, and in fact were deployed 6 months earlier than scheduled to respond to the threat posed by Separatist Admiral Duoningo's force of Bulwark-class battlecruisers running rampant in the Galactic Core. During the final months of the Clone Wars, we see the deployment of a completely new warship, the Imperator-class Star Destroyer. Far larger and more powerful than the Venator class, it was clear that the Imperator would eventually replace the Venator as the Navy's main Star Destroyer, and when Palpatine seized absolute power and declared the Republic an empire in 19 BBY, the Imperator was renamed the Imperial class. As predicted, the Imperial class slowly phased out the older Venator and Acclamator class vessels in the years following the Empire's reconquest of the Rim campaigns against CIS holdouts from 19 to 17 BBY. But while the Imperial-class Star Destroyer became the most iconic warship within the Imperial Navy, it wasn't the only one. Let's take a look. Contrary to what we see in the holofilms, the most common Imperial craft you would likely see is this, the IPV-1 Imperial Patrol Vessel, which, while not the largest nor the most powerful vessel, was commonly used on the Empire's far-flung frontier worlds and was more than enough to deter petty pirates and intercept smugglers. As for the Empire's starfighters, the end of the Clone Wars brought about the development of the Sienar Fleet System's twin ion engine starfighter, or TIE Fighter, a fast, agile, hyperdriveless short-range starfighter capable of being mass-produced in staggering numbers to overwhelm enemies. The design was so successful that it went on to inspire hundreds of TIE variants, from the humble TIE LN to the devastating TIE Defender. By the height of the Empire's power, there was a TIE variant to fulfill every combat role, from standard starfighters, interceptors, bombers, and reconnaissance, to specialized roles like boarding craft and even fully automated TIE fighters with droid brains. Of course, the Empire utilized non-TIE craft as well, such as the Cygnus Spaceworks XG-1 Starwing, A-Series interceptors, and other missile boats. Before we move on to the larger starships, it's necessary to mention the Empire's logistical vessels that aided the Navy in one of its primary roles as transportation for the Imperial Army and Stormtrooper Corps, such as the Lambda-class shuttle and Sentinel-class landers that ferry troops from capital ships to a planet's surface. Meanwhile, Y-85 Titan dropships were used for ferrying heavier ground equipment, such as Imperial AT-AT walkers. For more mundane day-to-day operations, the massive Altor-class replenishment ships could be moved anywhere at a moment's notice to refuel and resupply Imperial vessels in deep space without them having to return to friendly, properly equipped ports. And of course, there were also cargo haulers and courier ships in Imperial employ. Back to combat ships, a good number of the Empire's corvettes were leftovers from the Clone Wars, including the CR-90 and DP-20 corvettes that the Rebel Alliance would later put to good use, while the more commonly seen Broadside class, Raider class, and VT-49 Decimators were developed specifically for the Imperial Navy after the founding of the New Order. Moving on to frigates, we see the Nebulon B and Nebulon B2 escort frigates get their start in the Imperial Navy, where they were later appropriated by the Rebel Alliance. While the heavily armed and armored Victory II and Imperial II class frigates perform more traditional frigate roles, the Lancer class frigates, bristling with point defense quad laser cannons, were a nightmare for enemy starfighters, and were greatly feared by Rebel and later New Republic pilots.
While Imperial Star Destroyers had no trouble supporting their own sizable fighter complements, the Empire did have some dedicated carriers, including the Ton Falk-class escort carrier and the Imperial escort carrier, designed specifically for the Storm Commandos. Seldomly, they did utilize old Venator-class Star Destroyers as carriers with their massive ventral hangar bays, however they were a rare sight until the Empire's decline, years after Palpatine's demise, where many were put back into service. In the cruiser department, the Empire utilized many refit Dreadnought-class heavy cruisers, Carrack-class light cruisers, and Acclamator-class assault ships left over from the Clone Wars. The most feared Imperial cruiser, however, was the Immobilizer 418 Interdictor cruiser, equipped with 4 massive gravity well projectors capable of ripping enemy ships out of hyperspace and keeping them from retreating, making them high-value targets in every engagement they were deployed in. Now, on to Star Destroyers. We start with the obvious Imperial and Victory-class Star Destroyers that I already mentioned, but these would go on to spawn successors, such as the Imperial 2 and Victory 2 classes. Apart from minor structural differences, the main difference between these variations is armament. While the Imperial 1 class had a lot more in the way of ion weaponry and only sported 6 dual heavy turbo laser turrets, the Imperial 2 sacrificed many of the ion cannons for more laser cannons and turbo lasers, and also sported 8 massive octuple heavy turbo laser turrets. Meanwhile, the difference between the Victory classes was that the Victory 2 traded the Victory 1's myriad of concussion missile launchers for more turbo lasers and ion cannons, as well as faster engines. Other Star Destroyers include the Tector class, which is just an Imperial class without a hangar, the Secutor class, Interdictor class, Procusator class, and the Gladiator class, which, given its meager size of only 600 meters, should be classified as a cruiser, yet it has the moniker of a Star Destroyer. Next up the chain, we have battle cruisers, and these include the massive Praetor class, Praetor 2 class, Allegiance class, and the Taj battle cruisers, used by House Taj specifically during the Gordian Reach blockade shortly after the Battle of Yavin. Finally, we have the Star Dreadnoughts, sometimes referred to as Super Star Destroyers. These are the Empire's largest warships, and the ultimate symbols of Imperial naval might. At 19 kilometers long, the Executor-class Star Dreadnought began construction shortly before the Battle of Yavin, and while we don't know for sure, it is estimated that around 20 Executor classes were produced, but these were all that the New Republic could account for, and there may have been far more. Other Star Dreadnoughts produced for the Empire include the 15-kilometer-long Assertor class, the much smaller 7,200-meter-long Bellator class, among a few one-off Super Star Destroyers, like Inquisitor Jarrek's Vengeance class, and the 2 Eclipse-class Super Star Destroyers intended to be the personal flagships of the Emperor. Now that we have a better understanding of the variety of ships utilized by the Empire and their combat roles, we can begin to take a look at just how the Imperial Navy was organized, and dissect the varying orders of battle that these ships comprised. The smallest Imperial Navy unit is called a line, and can vary greatly in numbers of ships and ship type composition. Commanded by a line captain, there are 7 types of lines: attack lines, heavy attack lines, Star Destroyer lines, skirmish lines, pursuit lines, troop lines, and recon lines. Attack lines are composed of either 3 heavy cruisers or 6 to 8 light cruisers, and their primary role is to support Imperial Star Destroyers, directly engaging enemy forces while the Star Destroyer attacks the flanks. Heavy attack lines consist of 4 to 8 medium to heavy cruisers, and at times can possibly include one of the smaller Star Destroyers, like a Gladiator class or a Victory class. Heavy attack lines can engage the enemy directly without Star Destroyer support. A Star Destroyer line consists of, well, exactly 1 Star Destroyer, as the common Imperial 1 or Imperial 2 class has enough firepower to exceed or equal attack and/or heavy attack lines. Skirmish lines consist of 4 to 20 corvettes, and are primarily used to either support allied starfighters or act as a fighter screen against enemy starfighters. Pursuit lines consist of either 4 to 10 light cruisers or frigates, and, given their speed, are charged with the duty of pursuing and destroying retreating enemy ships. Troop lines consist of 2 assault transports and 2 medium cruisers, and are used for escorting and transporting Imperial Army or Imperial Stormtrooper Corps units to planetary surfaces. And then the Recon line, which consists of 2 to 4 light cruisers and does not engage in direct combat. Like its name implies, Recon lines are used to scout out and identify potential enemy targets. The next order of battle is a squadron, which can consist of several different lines and can vary greatly in numbers and line composition, depending on the specialization of the squadron, but usually does not exceed 60 ships. Squadrons are commanded by low-level admirals, most probably one in a rear admiral's position, and come in 5 specializations: light squadrons, heavy squadrons, battle squadrons, bombard squadrons, and troop squadrons. Light squadrons consist of 1 skirmish line and 1 recon line, and are usually assigned to systems that pose no real threat to Imperial rule and therefore require less firepower. Heavy squadrons can consist of either 1 attack line and 1 recon line for suspected enemy systems, 2 heavy attack lines for confirmed enemy systems, and in extreme cases of heavy resistance, 3 heavy attack lines and 1 skirmish line have made up a heavy squadron. Battle squadrons consist of 2 attack lines, 1 pursuit line, and at least 1 Star Destroyer line, and as its name implies, is deployed against heavily armed and armored enemy formations in direct confrontation. Troop squadrons consist of 2 troop lines, 1 attack line, and 1 skirmish line, and are tasked with transporting Imperial Army and/or Imperial Stormtrooper Corps contingents to embattled worlds. And then bombard squadrons consist of 1 skirmish line and 1 pursuit line, and are mustered solely to escort Lornar Defense Industries torpedo spheres used for pinpoint bombardments of enemy positions on contested planets. Next, we move on to the Systems Force, which can be comprised of multiple squadrons and varying numbers of ships, again, dependent on the specialization of the Systems Force, and can total around 90 ships. Systems Forces were commanded by a mid-level admiral, most likely a vice admiral, sometimes called a systems admiral, or, confusingly enough, a commodore, and came in 6 different specializations: Superiority Force, Escort Force, Transport Force, Systems Bombard, Force Technical Services, and a Support Force. A Superiority Force consisted of 3 battle squadrons and a light squadron, and was tasked with maintaining superiority within a given system, whether it was just a show of force for intimidation or in preparation for going toe-to-toe with an actual enemy threat. An escort force is composed of 2 heavy squadrons and 2 light squadrons, and, you guessed it, was tasked with escorting valuable Imperial assets, whether it was a high-ranking individual or some important weapon or artifact. Transport forces consisted of 2 troop squadrons, 1 heavy squadron, and 1 light squadron, and were tasked with transporting Imperial Army or Stormtrooper Corps troops with their equipment for planetary operations. A Systems Bombard consisted of 3 bombard squadrons and 1 light squadron, and was used to orbitally bombard large areas of a planet's surface held by enemy forces, usually cities and small continents. Force Technical Services operated more as a logistical grouping than an actual force per se, as they consisted of 8 transports and 2 escort frigates used for moving mechanical specialists and equipment to ships in need. Sort of tying into the operations of the Force Technical Services, support forces were often made up of over 100 container vessels for resupplying fixed-position Imperial depots. Next, we arrive at the fleet level of naval operations. A fleet, sometimes called a star fleet, consisted of a varying number of systems forces and ships, again, dependent on the specialization of the fleet, but usually totaled around 400 ships. Commanded by an admiral, and in some more prestigious cases, a fleet admiral, fleets came in 5 different specializations: a superiority fleet, assault fleet, bombard fleet, support fleet, and the deep dock fleet. A superiority fleet consisted of 2 superiority forces, 2 escort forces, at least 1 technical service force, and 1 support force. These fleets are primarily used to keep low-threat sectors in line. Assault fleets consist of 2 transport forces and 2 escort forces, and are used to transport Imperial Army and/or Stormtrooper Corps contingents for planetary-scale ground invasions of hostile worlds. Bombard fleets are comprised of 2 systems bombards and 2 escort forces, and are given the grisly task of carrying out Base Delta Zero operations. That is, a complete surface bombardment of an enemy planet, with zero regard for infrastructure damage or for civilian casualties. Support fleets are a purely logistical unit, made up of at least 500 container and cargo vessels that transport fuel, munitions, equipment, and other various supplies wherever they're needed, whether it's to an Imperial base, depot, shipyards, or one of the large construction projects like the Death Stars. And then, deep dock fleets are mobile dry docks, capable of repairing and resupplying Imperial starfleets anywhere in the galaxy, including in the middle of deep space, and total around 280 vessels escorted by 1 escort force. The deep dock itself was made up of a maximum of 125 modular work bays, which can be configured to service vessels of any size. It's interesting to note here, before we move on to the last 2 naval orders of battle, that Darth Vader's infamous Death Squadron, though called a squadron, resembles more of a fleet in terms of size and firepower, and was often referred to as one. Yet its composition completely disregards and exceeds any of the fleet structures we just established. Instead of the various lines, squadrons, and forces that make up the 400 vessels that would support a handful of Star Destroyers in a typical superiority fleet, it seemed that the Sith Lord had opted to forego this in favor of his flagship, the Executor-class Super Star Destroyer of the same name, which easily possesses the firepower of half of a fleet on her own, accompanied by at least 5 Star Destroyers at any given time, though that number has at times swelled to over a dozen Star Destroyers by the time of the Battle of Andor, thus putting Death Squadron in an odd position of being way too large for an actual squadron and bigger than a superiority fleet, but too small to be a sector group. Next, as we mentioned, we move on to the sector group, which is basically all of the fleets assigned to a specific sector. And given that sectors vary in size as well as number of habitable Imperial subject worlds, it's typical for the average sector group to consist of at least 2,400 ships, but more often than not, this figure is on the low end of that estimation. A sector group is commanded by the MOF, or regional governor in layman's terms, that controls that sector, and this MOF would also hold the title of High Admiral. In extreme cases where the sector in question is highly contested and seeing continuous action, the sector's MOF is left to deal with his or her civilian governing duties, while the title of High Admiral is appointed to a separate individual to focus military efforts in the sector unburdened. Lastly, over-sector groups, while rarely assembled during the Empire's height, consisted of all of the sector groups comprising the over-sector, of which there were around 22 over-sectors that we have documentation of. Over-sectors and over-sector groups are commanded by Grand Moffs, who also hold the title of Priority Sector High Commander. We now have a lot more insight into the ships of the Imperial Navy, their roles, and how they were organized, but we haven't yet answered the question of just how large was the Imperial Navy altogether. In this modern era, we don't really have a completely 100% accurate representation of how big the Imperial Navy was at its height, as the chaos of the Imperial Civil War after Palpatine's death makes it hard to keep track of fleet records, and as the New Republic captured or destroyed more Imperial vessels, the Imperial warlords and later the reunified Imperial remnant went through phases of constructing more ships and then losing them in subsequent military campaigns. Palpatine also had more vessels constructed off the official records at facilities on Biss, which he later utilized during his brief return 10 years after the Battle of Yavin. We do know, however, that in terms of your standard Imperial-class Star Destroyer, we will assume that this includes all 3 main variations, the Imperial 1, Imperial 2, and the Tector class, the Empire had over 25,000 Star Destroyers by the time of the Battle of Yavin, and by 19 ABY, just before the signing of the Paleon-Gaversum Treaty, that number had been severely diminished to just 200 Star Destroyers after 2 decades of fighting. As I stated earlier, New Republic intelligence reports of there being at least 20 accounted for Executor-class Star Dreadnoughts produced by the Empire, and while this doesn't give us an exact figure, we at least have a figure, and that's more to say than for the other classes of Star Dreadnought like the Bellator class and the Assertor class, which we have no specific numerical data for. However, these figures don't take into account the possible billions of starfighters and millions of patrol craft, corvettes, frigates, cruisers, heavy cruisers, other Star Destroyer classes, and battle cruisers, some of which were produced during Imperial rule, while others were leftovers from the Clone Wars, which leaves a rather big hole when trying to understand the true scale of the Imperial Navy. It's frustrating to say the least. Now, on to command structure. We talked a little bit about who commands what when discussing the order of battle of the Imperial Navy's fleets, but now we're going to go a little bit more in depth on the chain of command and the branches of service within that chain and the personnel who operate within them. At the very top of the flowchart, as with all of the Empire's institutions, the Emperor maintains direct control over all personnel, command chains, and supply chains. His orders override everything. However, more often than not, he defers to his Grand Admirals on most military matters concerning the Imperial Navy. More on them in a bit. Directly under the Emperor, his executor, Darth Vader, is named the Supreme Commander of the entire Imperial military, making him the head of not just the Imperial Navy, but also the Imperial Army and the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps. Unlike the Emperor, though, Vader often took an active role in leading his own fleets and ground forces, but he would usually defer to Naval Command for larger-scale campaign planning. Moving down from the High Command to the Imperial Navy branch of this command tree, because that's why we're here, after all, we've come to the Naval Command, which is headed by the Admiralty. At the head of the Admiralty is the Circle of 12, a dozen official Grand Admirals, all hand-picked and appointed by the Emperor, and these individuals included Mardio Batch, Niall Declan, Octavian Grant, Yosef Grunger, Ishin Ilraz, Afshin Makati, Danetta Pitta, Pachadi Sin, Milton Tackle, Oswald Teshik, Rufan Tigelinus, and Demetrius Zarin. A 13th Grand Admiral was later appointed by the Emperor in secret, and Grand Admiral Thrawn would go on to become one of his most trusted Grand Admirals. Grand Admirals are denoted by their stark white uniforms and golden epaulets. Underneath the Grand Admirals are the Grand Moffs, which we talked a bit about earlier. While Moffs and Grand Moffs typically deal more with municipal administration, they do have direct control of their military forces. Grand Moffs control the Empire's oversectors, sometimes called priority sectors, which are comprised of several sectors, as we had already discussed. The Moffs answer to the Grand Moffs and are in control of their individual sectors. As we discussed earlier, Moffs in most cases also hold the title of High Admiral and command all of the fleets in their sector. Where the Admiralty and the Naval Command overlap, the Admirals and Fleet Admirals control individual fleets within their sectors, and as previously discussed, the number of fleets in a sector vary with sector size and enemy activity level, and from there, Vice Admirals and Rear Admirals command system forces and squadrons. Underneath the Naval Command, the Imperial Navy is divided into 4 organizational branches, all working in tandem with one another, and these branches include the Line Branch, Flight Branch, Fleet Support Branch, and the Support Services Branch. The Line Branch is kind of what we already talked about when we discussed Order of Battle. This branch is responsible for tactics, strategy, and administration of the Empire's capital ships, and is further subdivided into several other divisions, the 3 largest of which are the Administration Division, Deck Division, and Logistics Division. Underneath the captain of the line, the commander of any given Imperial starship, no matter how large or small, is the captain, sometimes called the senior commander or just commander, and underneath the captain will be his lieutenants, the most high-ranking of which is the junior commander, followed by the senior and junior lieutenants. These officers make up the administration division aboard warships. In the Deck Division, ensigns and midshipmen relay their superiors' orders to the crewers piloting and navigating their vessels on their command decks, while those in Logistics Division are charged with making sure their vessels are adequately fueled, supplied, and staffed for full combat effectiveness. The Imperial Supply and Merchant Services are adjacently aligned to the Logistics Division, if not a subdivision of it. Most Imperial officers can be identified by their gray-green uniforms featuring a double-breasted tunic, cap, and black boots, with their rank being signified by a color-coded rank bar on the upper left pectoral flanked by code cylinders, the number of which depend on their rank. Midshipmen wore rank bars with 2 vertical pips, 1 red, 1 blue, and no code cylinders. Ensigns, junior lieutenants, senior lieutenants, and junior commanders wore rank bars with 4 pips, 2 red and 2 blue, with certain ranks having a code cylinder. Captains wore rank bars with 6 pips, 3 red and 3 blue, with 1 code cylinder. Rear, vice, and regular admirals wore rank bars with 8 pips, 4 red and 4 blue, with 2 code cylinders. Fleet admirals wore rank bars with 10 pips, 5 red and 5 blue, with 3 code cylinders. And high admirals and moffs wore rank bars with 12 pips, 6 red and 6 blue, with 4 code cylinders. In rare cases, some Imperial Star Destroyer commanders, such as the case with Commander Pragi of the ISD Devastator, have been seen wearing black uniforms, but these are more commonly associated with officers in the Stormtrooper Corps, and not normal for the Imperial Navy. Next, the Flight Branch encompasses the Imperial Navy's starfighters, their pilots, and support personnel, and within the Flight Branch you had the Flight Division, which administered the Starfighter Corps, which had its own command structure, personnel, and support divisions, which I will briefly gloss over here since they are deserving of their own transmission in the future. The smallest starfighter group was an element, which consisted of 2 starfighters, 1 leader and 1 wingman. Flights consisted of 3 to 4 starfighters, squadrons consisted of 12 starfighters, and fighter wings had up to 72 starfighters, or 6 squadrons, which was typical to see in the hangars of most Imperial Star Destroyers. Given the Spartan conditions inside most TIE fighter variants, TIE pilots wore fully sealed flight suits and a head-encompassing TIE pilot helmet, complete with its own air supply. This enthusiasm to pilot these short-range fighters lacking life support systems earned the TIE pilots the nickname Coffin Jockeys, and as the name suggested, the lifespan of a TIE pilot wasn't terribly long. Next, the Fleet Support Branch is responsible for maintenance and engineering duties aboard vessels, and is further divided into the Engineering Division, which operate and maintain the ship's sublight drives, hyperdrives, and hull integrity, and the Technical Services Division, which maintain the power distribution and life support systems. You can normally spot a technician of these divisions by their slate gray jumpsuits, black boots, and black caps. This division is also responsible for the various droids seen in service aboard Imperial vessels, such as the MSE-6, sometimes called mouse droids, that can be seen skittering through ship corridors, as well as the RA-7 protocol droid, and other general maintenance and protocol droids. Lastly, we have the Support Services Branch. This includes the crewers responsible for actually running the day-to-day operations of the capital ships, from astronavigators and helmsmen, communications technicians, to the medical personnel, sanitation engineers, and mess hall staff. These men and women wear similar uniforms to the technician of the Fleet Support Branch. Arguably, the most important personnel within the Support Service Branch are the Ordnance Technicians and Gunnery staff of the Ordnance and Gunnery Divisions. The Ordnance Division is responsible for the supply and maintenance of the ship's munitions, while the Gunnery Division fires and maintains the ship's various armaments. Imperial gunners of the Gunnery Division are distinguished by their distinctive helmets that protect the gunner from the bright flashes and deafening noise of a ship's laser cannons, turbo lasers, anti-starfighter lasers, etc., etc. Though it is not specifically stated in any of the documents I've perused for my research, I suspect that a few other divisions fall under the Support Service Branch category, mainly that of the Imperial Fleet Regiment, Imperial Naval Special Forces, and the Imperial Navy Commandos. Imperial fleet regiments are stationed aboard the Empire's capital ships and space stations, and like their Imperial Army counterparts, the Imperial Navy troopers of these fleet regiments are lightly armored with black jumpsuits and black helmets, and armed with the Blastech E11 blaster carbine. Imperial Navy troopers provide much-needed security and military policing aboard large vessels and stations, and are also crucial to defending the ship or outpost during enemy boarding actions. They often perform their duties alongside Imperial stormtroopers, especially if the fleet in question is transporting a planetary assault force. The Imperial Navy Special Forces, or SpecNav, was a small, highly secretive force, created in cooperation with Imperial intelligence to field highly mobile infantry units, completely independent from the Imperial Army and Stormtrooper Corps that could establish beachheads on enemy planets from which to launch invasions from. The Imperial Navy Commandos, on the other hand, were elite units, better trained and better equipped than the standard Navy troopers, wearing full plasteel helmets and carapaces with arm and leg armor. Navy Commandos are deployed in squads of 5 to 7, and are often assigned to higher value targets such as shipyards and even planetary surfaces and cities where the Navy has an orbital presence. Some other divisions that did exist, but I couldn't find any information on which of the 4 branches they fell under, were Imperial Navy Intelligence, which are kind of made redundant by Imperial Intelligence and ISB, Imperial Navy Research Development and Engineering Center, which designs new warships and weapons for the Empire, the Imperial Exploration Corps, and the Imperial Survey Corps, which explore, survey, and map out uncharted systems for future colonization. Since the declaration of the New Order in 19 BBY, the Imperial Navy became the fastest growing service branch within the Imperial military, considerably extending the Emperor's reach through technological innovation and aggressive militarism. Subsequent military campaigns following the end of the Clone Wars culminated in the reconquest of the Rim, which sought to pacify the once wilder frontiers of the Old Republic and destroy separatist holdouts resisting the new decrees. With the remnants of the Confederacy of Independent Systems snuffed out, the Imperial Navy switched gears from an offensive force to one of peacekeeping and enforcement. Yet this by no means slowed the influx of new recruits to the aforementioned naval academies now under direct Imperial jurisdiction, as wealthy core worlds sent their young men and women to become officers to bring their families honor and prestige, while the less fortunate on the mid and outer rims saw the Navy as a ticket off their boring and sometimes hellish backrocket worlds and to better career opportunities. Participation within the Imperial Navy, as Admiral Conan Antonio Motti wrote in his foreword to the Imperial Officer's Handbook, is dictated by the guiding principles of service, fealty, and fidelity, and every crewer within the Navy is held to the standard of the rather draconian Imperial Naval Code. I will honor the Empire in my thoughts and actions, I will obey my superiors, I will never shirk from my duties, I will maintain impeccable standards of conduct and appearance, I will use Imperial resources responsibly, I will complete every mission without hesitation, ambiguity, or mercy, I will recognize that the Empire is greater than myself and be willing to die in its service, and I will call out those who do not live up to the standards of the Naval Code. Motti goes on to outline his rather brutally honest version of the Imperial Navy's purpose, such as blockading ports and bombarding planets, which is pretty extreme, to guarding shipping lanes and transporting other branches of the military, which are the primary functions of every navy since the dawn of galactic civilization. While recruitment was ramping up, it's also around this time that the Empire began to nationalize the various companies it had contracts with during the Clone Wars and reconquest of the Rim, which includes the multitude of shipyards that produced the vessels for the Republic and now Imperial Navy. However, a majority of these new warship designs were Kuwati. No matter, since everything was now nationalized, it was of no consequence if a new design was Kuwati, Rendili, or Fondorian. Any shipyard under direct Imperial control could manufacture any ship, which led to some advantages and quirks among different vessels produced by different shipyards. For example, Imperial-class Star Destroyers produced using the Corellian Engineering Corporation's facilities on Corellia tended to be much faster, both at sublight speeds and in hyperspace, than ones produced at, say, Kuwat or Fondor. It wasn't until the formation of the Alliance to Restore the Republic in 2 BBY that the Imperial Navy began refocusing its efforts on offense, and even still, they barely took the Rebel Alliance seriously as a threat, until the destruction of Alderaan garnered more sympathy for the Rebels and their organization grew exponentially. In the wake of the first Death Star's destruction and Tarkin's death at the Battle of Yavin, the Imperial Navy proceeded to blockade the entire Gordian Reach sector, and once Vader's Executor-class Star Dreadnought was completed, an assault on the fourth moon of Yavin drove the rebels out of their base. Luckily for them, though, they were able to scout out and relocate many of their assets to a new base during the blockade. Vader, taking command of Death Squadron, made it his personal vendetta to locate and destroy the Rebel command fleet that hosted the Rebel High Command in the interim period during the construction of Echo Base on Hoth, though there were some hiccups along the way, as one Imperial crewer kept completely destroying Rebel outposts from orbit to ensure that there were no survivors for Vader to interrogate and glean valuable information from, and after initially blaming the commander in charge of the gunnery position, the Dark Lord quickly deduced that it was one of the gunners who hailed from Alderaan and had Rebel sympathies. The rogue crewer finally outed himself after annihilating yet another Rebel outpost, and was ready to face death at Vader's hands. Only the Sith Lord had a greater punishment in store from him, when he revealed that the last Rebel outpost he destroyed was in actuality a refugee colony for displaced Alderaanians who weren't on world when it was destroyed by the Death Star. It was Grand Admiral Thrawn's strategy of targeting Rebel supply lines through their clandestine dealings with smugglers and pirates that the Rebel base was narrowed down to the greater Javin sector, and subsequent probe droid drops revealed the base on Hoth in 3 ABY. The Imperial Navy would not be able to enjoy its subsequent victories at Hoth and Bespin for long, as at the fateful Battle of Endor in 4 ABY, the Executor was severely crippled and plunged into the surface of the second Death Star, which was destroyed itself by a Rebel strike team not long after. And with the Emperor, Vader, and Fleet Admiral Firmus Piet all dead, a majority of the Armada assembled at Endor scattered, while the rest were narrowly held together by Captain Gilad Pellaeon of the Star Destroyer Chimera. In the wake of the Rebel Alliance victory at Endor, the Imperial Navy became fragmented when several Moffs, Grand Moffs, and Admirals took personal command of their own fleets and sector groups to carve out their own miniature empires as warlords, while the rest of the Empire proper was being fought over in a power struggle between the Emperor's ruling council, Grand Vizier Sate Pestage, and Director of Imperial Intelligence Isani Isard. Galactic warfare was now dominated by Star Destroyers slugging it out with other Star Destroyers. The Circle of 12 Grand Admirals, meanwhile, were subsequently hunted down and dealt with by the New Republic, some killed in battle, others captured, tried, and executed, or in some cases offered clemency in exchange for valuable information that led to the liberation of more star systems from the Empire and the new warlords. Yet there was still one Grand Admiral not accounted for, as Thrawn had been busy for years in the unknown regions building an Imperial satrapy at the Emperor's behest, and he was able to briefly reunify the Empire in 9 ABY, before his demise at the Battle of Bilbringi, after which the Empire was once again torn apart by warlords, while a small contingent of loyalists kept a bit of the Empire together. Around 10 ABY, Imperial fleets were being summoned to the Deep Core, where Palpatine, now occupying one of his clones, had returned, and had constructed more warships to begin a renewed assault on the New Republic. And had it not been for the death of his last few clone bodies and the New Republic's determination, he may have even succeeded. But for now, the surviving warlords returned to power, and Imperial territory shrunk considerably. Years of protracted campaigns by the New Republic against the warlords as well as the Empire proper whittled down the Imperial Navy, as ships were destroyed or captured in the fighting, and with the fall of several major shipyards to the New Republic, like Kuat, Fondor, and Bilbringi, the Empire's ship-producing capabilities were severely diminished. The Empire was reunified one final time by Admiral Natasi Dalla, who, in 12 ABY, invited all of the remaining warlords to a meeting on an isolated space station in the Deep Core, where she proceeded to kill them all and take direct command of their fleets, being defeated herself after failed campaigns against the New Republic and Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Order. Dalla's reunification also brought about some reforms to the severely reduced Imperial Navy. The Circle of 12 had obviously been done away with after the loss of the Grand Admirals, and the Navy itself now fell under the direct control of the Supreme Commander, a position once held by Vader, now held by Admiral Gilad Pellaeon after Dalla's resignation. The Supreme Commander of the Imperial Navy also acted as a sort of figurehead for what was now called the Imperial Remnant, while the Moff Council governed the municipal aspects of the reunified Remnant, though the Moffs and the Supreme Commander would rarely see eye to eye, and more often than not, the Moffs would attempt to subvert the Supreme Commander's authority. Pelion, as Supreme Commander, would go on to broker peace with the New Republic in 19 ABY, with the signing of the Pelion-Gaversum Treaty, and at some point before the Yuuzhan Vong War broke out in 25 ABY, the position of Grand Admiral was reinstated and awarded to him. Grand Admiral Pelion continued to lead the Imperial Remnant and the Imperial Navy through the Yuuzhan Vong War and the Second Galactic Civil War in 40 ABY, before his death at the Battle of Fondor at the venerable age of 91, at the hands of Darth Caedus' Sith apprentice Tahiri Vela. An official head of state of the Imperial Remnant was created after the Second Galactic Civil War, doing away with the position of Supreme Commander, and at some point after, a new dynasty of emperors was ushered in with the ascension of Jagged and Jaina Solo Fel to the Imperial throne, bringing with them even further reforms to the Imperial Navy. As with the now combined Imperial Army and Stormtrooper Corps, the Imperial Navy now allowed non-humans to join as crewers, pilots, and officers. Meanwhile, the position of Supreme Commander was done away with, and the Council of Moffs now maintained direct control of the Imperial military, with at least one Moff heading each department of the military, while the Grand Moff, who was the senior-most authority on the Council, also held the title of Grand Admiral and led the Navy. By 128 ABY, the ships of the Imperial Navy had also modernized. The massive Pelion-class star destroyers with their angular Kuwati designs carried squadrons of Predator-class starfighters, successors to the TIE fighters, escorted by Ardent-class fast frigates. 7 years after Darth Krayt usurped Emperor Roan Fel and took control over the Empire himself, a new warship, intended to be the first of a new class, the Imperius, neared completion at the Mon Calamari shipyards, but in 137 ABY was stolen by Admiral Gar Stasi of the Galactic Alliance Remnant, which he used as his flagship throughout the rest of the Second Imperial Civil War, until Krayt was defeated and Galactic Order was restored. It just goes to show that even in this modern era, long after the Palpatinistic grabs for power and domination, the forces of the Imperial Navy still pack the same potency and intimidation that they had at the Empire's height during the Galactic Civil War.
This ends my findings on the Imperial Navy. If you have any suggestions for future transmissions, don't be afraid to drop a comment. Special thanks to my Ori Ramakad tier patrons, Batterai, Bowfix, Brendatsky Kabor, Cherryman, Hawk2274, Ian Waller, Jaleel, John Hollingsworth, Kyle Scarata, Kian Kier, Matt Patton, Mayo4, The Commando Droid, Scruffy Looking Nerf Herder, Weston Simmons, Wirefox Terrier, Zim the Despot, and Zexend. If you'd like to support this channel, please visit my Patreon to find out how. Link is in the description. In the meantime, keep your comm channels open for future transmissions, and don't forget to subscribe. Tad Larkin, out.